History is full of amazing stories and memorable people.
But we don't care about them.
No hits, deep tracks only.
Some of the most influential people in the world have been completely overlooked or just plain forgotten.
We're digging deep into the history books to bring you their stories.
I'm Phil.
And I'm Matt.
We're not historians. We're just two guys who enjoy a great story and plenty of laughs.
This is History's B-Side. Today's B-Sider is The Undercover Klansman.
I feel like this has come up before, or we've mentioned it in passing, but are you into superheroes?
I would say I'm fairly into superheroes. I didn't read the comic books or anything, but I definitely have followed the movies that have come out recently, and I have specific, superheroes that pique my interest more than others.
Do you know the whole backstories and canons on any of them?
No, I mean, if it wasn't in a Marvel movie, no.
So you are
or
geared
a
towards
DC
Marvel,
movie.
or have you seen both?
I've seen more. I guess I've more thoroughly covered the Marvel Cinematic Universe than I have the DC films. I've watched a couple shows and movies like The Dark Knight I'm familiar with that were DC based, but I didn't really watch any of the Superman that came out, at least not thoroughly enough to feel like I'm into Superman, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, this is bad, but I haven't seen any of the new Marvel movies. And not even
so many.
By new Marvel movies, I mean the ones that have come out over the last almost 20 years now. How long have they been going on like this?
Oh, they've been going on for a while.
At least the last 10 or 15 years, I feel like. But I haven't seen any of those. I was kind of into the old Spider-Man movies. They've redone them so many times, but I think it was Tobey Maguire. Is that who the actor was?
Yes. In the first one, yeah.
Yeah, I like those movies, and then I've always been kind of into Batman. Although when I say that, there are certainly comic book people that are way more into this stuff than I am. But I've always liked Batman. I really liked the Dark Knight series. It was Batman Begins and then Dark Knight and those newer Christian Bale Batman movies. But I also loved. My dad used to rent these from the library. The old Batman from the 60s, I think it was.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember those where you'd have the kapow on the screen every time there was a fight scene? That was always really funny to me.
High tech. The CGI was banging back then.
Yeah. I've never really watched any Superman stuff, though, or really Iron Man or any of the other, I don't know, superheroes besides maybe Spider-Man and Batman.
Yeah, there's I don't know, 20-some movies now, maybe 30 that are in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So it's a pretty big endeavor to try to watch them all. I'm into it, and I haven't watched them all, so...
It's just to the point where I feel like I've missed the boat too much that I wouldn't even know where to jump in.
Yeah.
And then it's too much to watch for me to get into it.
That was my very first quarantine activity, was starting from the beginning, because there's two different ways you can watch them. One is chronologically, which is theoretically in this universe all the movies happen at a certain time, and there's Easter eggs and things in each that refer to the others. So you can watch them in chronological order, or you can watch them in release order, which are slightly different. So there's a Captain America that might happen to the story happens after another movie, but it was released first. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean...
So anyway, I watched them all chronologically at the beginning of quarantine, and it took a week, a solid week of just sitting and watching Marvel movies for most of the day.
That's fast. I feel like it would take me several months to get through
all of them. I was quarantined. I didn't have anything else to do.
I guess that's true.
It was just that and video games for 2 weeks.
I've never really got the whole DC versus Marvel thing, and I know people that are super into comic books or the backstories would have stronger opinions than I would, obviously, but I feel that both of those groups of superheroes have very similar qualities to each other. I feel like Superman and Captain America are like the stereotypical patriotic good guy, and then you have the super wealthy but doesn't really have any superpowers guy that's Batman and Iron Man.
Yeah.
And then I don't know enough about the rest of them to make the analogy, but I just feel like there's a lot of similarities between the two groups.
I think there's definitely similar themes. I mean, Superman's technically an alien, or like, I don't exactly understand it, but
yeah.
he's not like a human.
I know. I mean, they're slightly different.
I can't remember the name of them now. This is going to bother me.
Are you looking it up right now?
Yeah. What is Superman? A Kryptonian.
Oh, okay.
He's an individual from another planet, it says. I don't know if that's different than alien. Anyway.
So you mostly just watched the movies. You haven't consumed any other media on them, I guess?
I've watched some of the series, but not a lot of them, especially the ones that have come out recently. I just don't have time to keep up on that many shows. And other than some like comic book based computer games I played when I was really little.
Oh yeah.
I didn't really focus on the comic books too much. I was into Spider-Man mostly when I was little, and Batman. I grew up during the era of the really corny Batman movies with George Clooney.
I like the old stuff. I mean, I like I said, I've really only seen movies, and I haven't seen that many of them to have a huge opinion on the whole superhero lore. But
yeah,
I have seen like an older series of like Avengers. It was like a animated TV series that was the Avengers. And then I really do like some of the older style movies, TV shows. I'm not really into comic books, but I think that stuff would be super cool to kind of flip through. I just like the nostalgia of those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite superhero?
I mean, I guess if I had to choose one, like Spider-Man's probably the one I've been following the longest, or I guess interested in the longest. Also like Iron Man. I like the sassy ones. I don't know. Iron Man, Spider-Man, Deadpool.
Yeah, I guess I would probably say Batman just because that was the one I kind of grew up with. But I really like the Spider-Man movies that I've seen. I know my father-in-law is into Superman. I don't know how into it he is, but they always buy him the Superman t-shirts, and he's bought me Superman socks and stuff that I've worn on occasion. Even though I've never been super into Superman. That was a weird way to say that.
I feel like Superman is the not quintessential, but if the superhero world had a spokesperson, I feel like it would be
stereotypical superhero is Superman. Yeah. And that's kind of in the name right there, isn't it?
Yeah. If you polled everybody on the first thing they think of when you say superhero, I feel like Superman would come out on top.
I know I've mentioned on some past episodes that I've been watching Seinfeld on Netflix, and there is a Superman pictured in the background in almost every single episode, if not every episode.
Really?
Yeah, because Jerry Seinfeld himself loves Superman. So there's figurines in his apartment and magnets on his fridge, and if they're not at the apartment, they're somewhere else in the episode, I think. So that was kind of a gimmick. I only noticed a couple because I wasn't paying too much attention to it, but I've read that there's Supermans in every episode of Seinfeld.
Funny. Now I have a reason to watch Seinfeld.
Yeah, for the Easter eggs like you talked about.
Yeah.
So this is kind of maybe a weird way to introduce this topic, but Superman himself will actually play a little bit of a role into today's story, specifically those old style superhero stories that we talked about, referring in this case to an old radio show called The Adventures of Superman.
Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. Look, up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's Superman.
Kellogg's Pep. P-E-P, Pep. Kellogg's Pep, the Sunshine Cereal, presents The Adventures of Superman.
I love anytime that you go back and watch something old, you get the old sponsors in there. Like,
Yeah.
you ever watch like old TV shows or something on YouTube and they have the ads from the 90s or whatever? I love hearing the radio sponsor there. And any of this kind of stuff gives you good like nostalgia feeling when you go back and listen to it. You got the organ music and the old themes for Superman, makes you feel like you're really into superheroes. But this was kind of a big part of how media was consumed, in the time period that we're going to talk about for this episode. The Adventures of Superman aired as a radio show from February 12th, 1940 until March 1st, 1951. So 11 years of being on the airwaves as a daily afternoon kids show.
Dang.
They produced 2,088 episodes, each of which were about 15 and a half minutes long. And like I said, the show was aimed at kids, but Superman in these stories took on very realistic, call them parodies, of American adversaries that they were facing in real life. So this took place during World War II. So Superman took on some version of Nazi Germany and Hitler and a lot of the...
So he is like Captain America.
Yeah, it really is. Like, that's what I mean. They have some similarities between them, that they kind of face these like real life opponents, and kind of plays into the whole propaganda thing.
Yeah.
It's a little scary that we were targeting this at kids, but it was a way of not just like, kids aren't going to go buy Kellogg's cereal, but if the kids are listening to it, their parents are also listening to it. So it's a way to kind of mix in the propaganda message to reach the adults, even though the kids don't realize it's anything more than just a story.
All right.
One of those very realistic adversaries that Superman took on was a group known as the Clan of the Fiery Cross. That was actually...
Who's the Clan of the Fiery Cross, Phil?
So that was a real series of episodes in this Adventures of Superman radio show. And as you can probably guess by the name, the Clan of the Fiery Cross, he was taking on a fictional version of the KKK. Yep. And that's who we're going to talk about on today's episode.
Oh, goody.
So I guess we'll start out with the episode. I mean, we're, 12 or 13 minutes into it already. So we'll start out today's episode by getting a little into the history of the Ku Klux Klan. And the KKK as we know it existed in kind of a few different iterations. A lot of historians will describe it as having been split into basically two versions. Some people refer to it as three. So we'll get into a little bit of why that is. The original Ku Klux Klan was founded as a social club in Pulaski, Tennessee, following the Civil War in 1866. And the name Ku Klux Klan is derived from the Greek word kiklos, or kyklos, which translates to circle, but that Greek word specifically refers to government cycles. So they use that word to describe how governments were kind of turning over. And I think that's sort of relevant to the time period that the Ku Klux Klan was founded in, because the government was really changing at this point, that what we went through during the Civil War, from kind of turning from the United States to these guys would have been a part of the Confederacy, and then back to being a part of the United States, and they probably had some ideas of overthrowing what was the established government. So that made sense to them to go with this Greek word of kiklos, and then adding clan because they were a group kind of for the alliteration KLAN instead of CLAN. This group quickly and probably unsurprisingly turned violent against black freedmen in opposition to racial reconstruction. By the summer of 1867, the group had organized into what they referred to as the Invisible Empire of the South, with a hierarchical structure including a Grand Wizard, who was the leader of the entire KKK, and underneath him would be other leaders that kind of oversaw certain areas, and they had titles such as the Grand Dragons, Grand Titans, and Grand Cyclopses.
I'd honestly find it hard to take somebody seriously who called himself like a Grand Cyclops.
So
or a Grand Dragon.
Yeah, and that's kind of...
Is it on your business card? Like, how do you know?
That's kind of what's goofy about the KKK, is that these were like serious titles to them, and all this was very serious to them, and if they weren't so violent, that it would just be viewed as this goofy organization in history. But like,
right,
these guys took these titles seriously, and they really believed it. It's just kind of like... It's the kind of thing that if you knew some friends who made up their own organization and gave themselves titles like this, you would kind of laugh at them and the whole idea of it.
Probably.
They also wore these white robes and sheets, which was also kind of a goofy thing, but they thought that it made them look intimidating.
I'm trying to imagine these early meetings. Like, what should we wear?
White. White is right. That's them saying that, not me. Don't clip me saying
boy.
that. That is not
All
what I
right.
believe.
Next point.
Yep. Well, the next point has to do with white supremacy, so. It was their plan to restore white supremacy throughout the South. And despite some federal government pushback, they were largely successful in this.
What kind of pushback were they getting from the federal government?
I mean, we'll talk about this. Eventually, the KKK would be established as a terrorist organization of sorts because they were violent, and the government kind of tried to prevent violent activities from taking place. Although, kind of the whole idea of the KKK is that they act behind the scenes in secrecy with codes and trying to work in ways that aren't necessarily obvious. So
Gotcha.
the government kind of took an approach that as long as they weren't being outwardly, obviously violent and destructive and obstructive to general ways of life, they didn't really do much about it. Regardless, by the mid-1870s, the Klan largely disbanded, at least this first iteration of it. They, like I said, they were labeled a terrorist organization by a federal judge, and federal troops began to crack down on their activities more severely. So they actually kind of announced that they were no longer an organization by 1872. But also, their mission was essentially successful. The South was largely run entirely by whites, so this need, quote unquote, for a white supremacy movement really wasn't a need anymore. They kind of set out what they established to and, didn't have to have these violent activities anymore.
Do you think they continued to operate in secret, even after the public disbanding of the organization?
I'm sure,
at least the main people.
In some levels, maybe more on that social club level of just kind of getting together with people that agreed with your beliefs, but they weren't necessarily organized to having a grand wizard and other leaders with a organizational structure. In 1915, the film The Birth of a Nation was released, and this film really glorified the original Ku Klux Klan and all of its successes and activities and how great they were. Obviously, this is its own bit of propaganda, but this film brought a revival of the Klan movement, which started in Atlanta, Georgia, and quickly spread across small towns, particularly in the South and the Midwestern states. This new Klan, which is kind of viewed as the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan, really peaked in the 1920s, and remnants of this revival still exist today. We'll kind of talk throughout this episode about how this second version of the KKK really was largely ended around the mid-1940s. So that's why some historians do believe that there's a third version of the Ku Klux Klan that kind of started in the 50s and 60s. But it's really just this same second version that never totally went away. It just shrunk down to almost nothing by the mid-1940s, and then pockets of it still popped up every now and then to cause problems in more recent years.
Okay.
And it was this new Klan that made famous their cross-burning rituals, as well as bringing back the robes, symbolism, and violence of the original Ku Klux Klan. And while the original KKK focused on hatred of blacks, the new Klan added attacks against Roman Catholics, Jews, foreigners, and organized labor.
WASPs only. America.
Yeah.
We're like, just exclude everybody.
Sort of familiar to some things that we hear, and some things that were going on in the world in the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah.
Their membership slowed during the Great Depression, and like we said, was almost eliminated in the mid-1940s, which will be kind of the point of today's episode. But this new Klan gained second life during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. And the KKK today still kind of rears its ugly head politically. Oftentimes they're rebutted by counter-political movements. So a couple examples of those. President Lyndon Baines Johnson publicly denounced the organization after Klan members killed a white civil rights worker in the 1960s. More recently, when KKK Grand Wizard David Duke, who, at least in my opinion, is the most notable KKK member, at least the most notable one that I could name today, he ran for governor of Louisiana in 1991. And after he won the primary and seemed fairly likely that he was going to end up winning the entire governor election, the NAACP threatened economic boycotts of the state of Louisiana, which led to Duke's election defeat in the general election. But he still did actually win more than 50% of the white vote, which is kind of scary.
Oof.
Most recently, as the KKK's membership remains fairly small, stagnant, and isolated, and this is in today's version of America, they do still appear alongside other domestic terrorist groups like neo-Nazis and other kind of extremist right-wing white supremacy type nationalist groups. And a good example of this was I forget what they called it, but the rally that took place in Charlottesville, Virginia in August of 2017. And for at least for us and some modern listeners who maybe were paying attention to headlines only within the last couple of years, they would remember that incident as being kind of really the first test of the Trump presidency to stand up against white nationalist movements and huge counter protests that took place on that day.
Yeah. Stand back and stand by, Phil.
Oh dear.
Derailing the entire episode.
Nope. This is a good time for us to take our break. So now that everyone has a little base knowledge on the KKK, we're going to talk today about one man who kind of infiltrated them and learned a lot about their secrets and used it to expose them and really did some damage to the structure of the Ku Klux Klan. But before we get into that, we will take a quick break and we'll be right back.
So our listeners are pretty used to hearing us talk about what we're drinking on the episodes that we record. And usually it's beer, wine, or some sort of spirit, sometimes that has to do with the B-sider of the day. But today I'm just drinking a cup of coffee. And to be honest with you, Phil, it's the single worst cup of coffee I think I've made for myself in several years.
Oh no, is it truck stop coffee? Because I've had a lot of experience drinking truck stop coffee recently.
Honestly, I don't know how I did it, but this might be worse than truck stop coffee. It doesn't have the metallic taste, but it's definitely, it's on par with a terrible gas station cup of coffee.
That sounds disgusting.
It's delightful.
Maybe you should buy some coffee, or someone should buy you coffee.
You know what? I like that second option a little bit better. And it works out because we're here today to tell our listeners about a new listener support service we're using called Buy Me a Coffee. And you can find us and buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside.
And it's cool because there's a couple different ways that our listeners can get involved and support the show. Number one, you could just donate to the show by clicking Buy Them a Coffee.
2, you can join as a member with levels starting at $5 per month. A few of the membership perks include monthly bonus episode titled History's B-Side Battles, in which we debate to see which B-sider would come on top in a battle royale to the death. You also get access to our future episode queue, discounts on extras on our online shop, and History's B-Side gifts and swag.
And those extras, like you mentioned, include things like choosing topics for future episodes. You can buy custom postcard sets or stickers, and we even have some things like coffee mugs or some future merch that we're going to add on there as we go. And you obviously don't have to be a member to get those things, but if you are a member, you get a discount on them, and it's actually a much better deal, 25 to 50% off what you would if you weren't a member.
It's a great way for our listeners to support us in a more casual way and make sure that we're not recording while drinking terrible cups of coffee like the one I have in my hand right now.
The website again is buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside. We so appreciate your support. It's what helps us continue to put these episodes on every single week and continue our research and make sure you're learning about all the cool people from history that we sometimes forget.
With that said, let's get back to today's B-sider.
All right. So now that we got a little background on the Ku Klux Klan, let's talk about one of the peskiest thorns in their side in the 1940s. The man we're talking about today is named William Stetson Kennedy, but he's most commonly known by just his middle and last name, Stetson Kennedy. I actually didn't know his first name. I found the name of the guy when he's been sitting on my list of like 2 research episodes. I didn't know his name was William until I started actually typing out the outline. I just thought his first name was Stetson.
Yeah.
So he was born on October 5th, 1916 in Jacksonville, Florida. His parents were George Wallace Kennedy, which is a great Southern name. You know, anytime you hear the name George Wallace, you know it's very South, a little bit of racist thrown in there. and his mother was Willie Stetson, and I guess that's the tradition of naming your son by your mother's maiden name. His family was part of the Southern aristocracy, which was a wealthy class of families who essentially controlled Southern agriculture, including owning plantations and managing the slave trade. So they were a wealthy family. Slavery wasn't really too much of a thing at this point because we are, post-Reconstruction and the Civil War. But It was kind of inherited family wealth, so they were obviously very important to Florida and the area that they lived.
It's funny to me that being from this background, he ended up infiltrating the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah, so his whole story is very opposite of what you would expect from his familial history.
Right.
In fact, so 2 of his uncles were notable when I was reading on his family background. One of them, named John Batterson Stetson, is credited with having invented the cowboy hat, which isn't that important to his story, but I thought that was really cool. And maybe that was something, I don't know, not like a super world-changing thing in history, but kind of a funny, this guy invented it. It's known as the Stetson hat. And then he had another uncle who was only known by the name Brady. And this guy actually served as the Great Titan, which was a top Klan official of a specific congressional district. So he had relatives who were in the KKK. Like, this was built into his family and ingrained in him. As a young boy, Stetson became enamored with Florida culture, reading and writing folklore and poetry. He graduated from Robert E. Lee High School, which I was like, that sounds familiar. So I looked it up, and they actually renamed that school to Riverside High School in 2021. So a little bit of what we've been living through as far as kind of whether or not we should keep these Confederate generals' names on things. But beyond that, he enrolled at the University of Florida in 1935. Here he became interested in activism, collecting boots and blankets for the Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War. He didn't actually graduate from the University of Florida. He left there in 1937 to join the Federal Writers Project. The Federal Writers Project was an initiative funded by the Works Progress Administration to help out-of-work writers during the Great Depression. So for this job, Kennedy became sort of an archivist, curating works of Florida folklore and culture for the Library of Congress, and edited the Works Project Administrative Guide to Florida.
This honestly sounds like a pretty cool job. Like archiving folklore.
Yeah, you'd be doing a lot of reading and writing for sure. In the early 1940s, Kennedy served as the editorial director of the Political Action Committee for the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which is essentially working on behalf of labor unions for industrial workers in Atlanta. And this led him to write articles and briefs advocating against typically racist voting practices, such as poll taxes and white primaries. And like you said, this kind of was the opposite of what we maybe would have expected him from his family history. But Stetson Kennedy kind of had this idea of race activism ingrained in him from a very young age. And it would really kind of shape a lot of the decisions he made later in life. While he was still a young boy, Stetson became very close with his family's black maid, a woman named Flo.
Did his family own slaves?
Not his... At least from everything that I read, his immediate family wouldn't have because they were post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction. But,
okay, that makes sense.
I mean, almost certainly his ancestors would have owned slaves if they were part of that Southern aristocracy that owned all the plantations and managed the slave trade. Like, I didn't find it in reading, but I could say almost without a doubt that his ancestors in the Kennedy and Stetson families probably did own slaves.
Yeah.
But this woman, Flo, probably was just a hired home caretaker, basically. So I'm sure she was paid, probably not very much if we had to guess, but that's kind of what we talked about that on the Mary Fields episode, that a lot of black women, especially post Reconstruction, kind of had to take these jobs as just kind of maids and caretakers for the homes because they weren't really skilled to do anything else. And Stetson viewed this woman, as in his own words, as almost like a mother. Much of his views on race would be influenced by his relationship to her. In the 1920s, Flo was actually beaten and raped by members of the Ku Klux Klan. They had accused her of, quote, sassing white folk because she had questioned a bus driver who gave her incorrect change. And Kennedy retold this story throughout his life as a counter to the idea that Klan members were Christian patriots by saying, quote, at a very tender age, I became aware that grown-ups were lying about a whole lot more than Santa Claus.
That's good.
His father, George Wallace Kennedy, owned a furniture store, and it was Stetson's job to go door to door collecting the $1 down, $1 a week payments from his father's customers.
I wish I could get that deal on a car.
Right. You probably could if you buy it around, what holiday we have coming up? President's Day weekend? Something like that.
$1 down, $1 a week. I'll pay it off by the time I'm 80.
You wish. Stetson claimed that it was this job that began to expose him to the racial and economic disparities within his own hometown, which he viewed as only a small sample of the country at large. He wrote in 1936, saying, quote, during months spent trying to pose as a hard-boiled bill collector, seeking payments on furniture accounts from impoverished Southern whites and Negroes during the depths of the Depression, I became acutely aware of 1/3 of the nation. No sooner was I aware of their problems than I determined to do something about them. It seemed simple at first. I would write a book telling how the multitudes suffered from lack of food, clothing, shelter, and the other 2/3 of the nation, who couldn't possibly realize how much suffering was going on, would read the book and take appropriate action to alleviate the distressful conditions. I was not long so naive.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, that's probably not going to work.
It reminds me of the people that just have this very idealistic view of the world that they post on Facebook and Twitter every day.
Yeah, the rich aren't going to part with their money.
But
it's not happening.
This idealistic viewpoint kind of led to some of the activism and work with race that we talked about when he was working for the Political Action Committee of the Labor Union, and then some of the other things that he will continue to do later in his life, which is all, like we said, despite his family history. You kind of would expect the opposite of him, but he became aware of these problems when he was pretty young and decided to do something about them. In the early to mid-1940s, as the United States was entering World War II, Kennedy was unable to enlist in the Army due to an existing back injury. So instead he looked for ways that he could patriotically serve his country domestically. His idea was to go undercover and infiltrate the Ku Klux Klan to learn their secrets and expose them as racial terrorists who use violence to enforce local Jim Crow laws. He would later write 2 books detailing these experiences, which were titled Southern Exposure, published in 1946, and in 1954 a book titled The Klan Unmasked, which was originally titled I Rode with the Ku Klux Klan. Kennedy began his mission by working with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to pose as John S. Perkins, a racist encyclopedia salesman from Atlanta, Georgia.
Why an encyclopedia salesman?
I mean, I didn't find anywhere why they picked that kind of cover story, but I mean, if I'm going to try to piece it together, like, he obviously has some background in reading and writing, so you can see the encyclopedia. He has some background in going door to door, maybe not as a salesman, but I think he could speak from those experiences to make himself seem realistic. It also just kind of seems like the generic mundane job that, you know, someone who might be racist comes from, because they interact with lots of different people and develop some opinions in that way. Not to say that anyone who would work this type of
all
job today
encyclopedia salesmen
would have
are
those
racist,
thoughts, but
is what Phil just said.
How many people are going door to door selling encyclopedias at this point? Watch, there's someone
Probably
out there
true.
who goes door to door selling encyclopedias and listens to podcasts while he does it, and is like, I hate these guys, I'm going to write them an angry email. And you can do so. historiesbside@gmail.com. My name is Matt.
Wow. We're gonna get a letter from some guy named George Wallace the Fourth.
While inside the Ku Klux Klan, Kennedy donned the Klan robes, participated in cross burnings, and gave racist speeches, all while collecting information about the KKK and its activities. This actually helped him rise to the position of, ready for it, Cavalier.
I hate it. It's so bad. Oh my god, this must have hurt his brain being an English guy studying folklore and reading and writing. He must have been like, God, you guys are so corny.
In this position, he was expected to exercise force or violence, which was similar to like what a mafia strongman would do. He also swore a blood oath to never betray the secrets entrusted to him as a Cavalier of the Klan, which is a tongue twister. And come on, guys, if you're going to do blood oaths, like, make them easier to say.
Cavalier.
Fortunately for historians, Kennedy did not uphold this blood oath, and he would go on to write about his experiences, and his writings would expose the Klan's secret rituals and activities. Their beliefs were that they were God-fearing, law-abiding lovers of patriotism, which is something that many, particularly white Americans, would sympathize with today, even if they disagree with the Klan's approach to these beliefs. More importantly, he exposed the goals of the Klan's invisible empire, which included to shield the sanctity of the home and the chastity of womanhood.
Oh, wow.
To maintain white supremacy. To teach and faithfully inculcate... I don't know that word.
Inculcate.
To teach and faithfully inculcate a high spiritual philosophy through an exalted ritualism, which just sounds like a whole bunch of jargon that means nothing.
Yeah.
And by a practical devotedness to conserve, protect, and maintain the distinctive institutions, rights, privileges, principles, and ideals of a pure Americanism, which sounds a whole lot like, you know, the type of nationalism, National Socialism that was being fought overseas at this very same time. And Kennedy really did liken the racism that he was fighting at home to that of the racism his peers were fighting overseas in World War II. He also worked to expose Klan members and their allies, which included politicians, business leaders, journalists, ministers, and police officers. Comically, his descriptions of the rituals and activities of the Klan were similar to how we would portray those of typical, like, frat bros in almost like a college-based comedy movie. Like,
yeah,
I just imagine when you
like
think
Animal
about
House.
like a...
Which you haven't seen.
Yeah.
Yeah. I knew it.
I just imagine when you see these like college setting frat B-rate movies that are like the guys don the robes for their initiation ceremonies, and then that's kind of how the Klan actually was. I came across a quote that said, exposing their folklore, all their secret handshakes, passwords, and how silly they were dressing up in white sheets. If they weren't so violent, they would be silly. And that was from a woman named Dr. Peggy Bulger, who we will talk about later on in the episode.
Did she mention, or did you find anything specific about the silly stuff they did?
I mean,
like,
I think
more
it's
specifically.
I think it's just a lot of the stuff that we were even mentioning earlier. Like, they had these ridiculous titles, they wore these robes, they had secret handshakes and code words and all this stuff. Like, it was originally a social club, and they just tried to make it this whole serious thing. And it's literally, if they weren't going around murdering people and burning down houses and threatening people, like, it would have just been a really goofy social club that most
just
people would be embarrassed to be a part of. Yeah. And we think about that a lot with these types of groups today. Like, this morning, I saw Nazis was trending on Twitter because I sometimes expose myself to Twitter. And I clicked on it because I was curious, because we just released an episode about Nazis not that long ago, 2 weeks ago. And like, there was literally a group of modern day Nazis, like they call themselves the National Socialists of America, who were marching in Orlando. Like, and you look at the videos of them, these people are ridiculous. Like, they look stupid. They're embarrassing. I feel awkward watching them, and they're serious about this stuff. Like, it's hard to look at those people and be like, how are you a functioning adult, like, outside of this? I don't get the disconnect in people that are like this.
Yeah.
So by 1946, Kennedy began to cautiously distribute his findings to journalists, politicians, human rights organizations, and others. And this risked exposing himself, which might have dangerous consequences. He couldn't have known if his reports might accidentally be sent to a Klan member or a sympathizer, which really
Yeah.
put himself at risk of physical retaliation. He received help from Drew Pearson, a journalist and radio host who would actually read the minutes from Klan meetings on his national radio show.
This seems pretty risky. Like, don't you think once they found out their minutes were being read on the radio, they'd like immediately shut things down and start?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, at this point, I don't know if Kennedy is still posing as part of the Klan, like a member of the Klan. He might be, but I think by the time that he starts kind of sending out his findings, I think he's gotten himself out of there. But it would be very dangerous if he was still going to these meetings because, you know, they're going to start looking for the rat. They're going to try to find out who's leaking their secrets and everything because that's kind of, you know, the whole purpose of the Klan is acting in secret. And if that stuff starts getting out there, then they need to put a stop to that, and they're going to try to figure out who's the leak.
Right.
So once these started to be read on national radio shows, members who were embarrassed to be publicly outed like this began to leave the KKK, and its total membership began to decline. Kennedy then reached out to the producers of The Adventures of Superman, the radio show, and he pitched the idea of Superman battling the KKK.
Naturally.
As we said earlier, Superman had been known for taking on real-life villains, including Hitler and Mussolini, and since World War II had just ended, the show was in need of a new storyline and villain. They produced a series of 16 episodes in which Superman took on the Clan of the Fiery Cross, which used the KKK's actual organizational structure, code words, and more provided to the writers of the radio show by Stetson Kennedy.
Wow.
This actually led to Klan members boycotting the products of the Kellogg's Company, which was the major sponsor of the Adventures of Superman. However, this specific story arc earned great ratings and led to Superman being the most highly rated children's radio program, and Kellogg's maintained its support of the show. This reminds me actually a lot of when we see people today kind of boycotting companies that advertise on Fox News or CNN, depending on your political lean. I don't know how particularly effective any of those are, but I mean, you do see like sponsors matter. Like that's the whole reason that the Washington football team dropped Redskins from its name, because their major stadium sponsor was going to pull out if they would have kept the Redskins name. Of course, that didn't work. Apparently the Klan wasn't successful enough to pull Kellogg's out of the Superman
They tried.
radio show, and they continued to covertly publish Klan secrets on a kids radio program. And as the KKK's secrets began to be exposed more publicly, it became more difficult for them, an organization built around its secrecy and clandestine activities, to recruit and maintain new membership. In the 2005 book Freakonomics, authors Stephen J. Dubner and Stephen Levitt described Stetson Kennedy as, quote, the greatest single contributor to the weakening of the Ku Klux Klan.
Nobody wants to go against Superman.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Stetson Kennedy himself maybe sort of viewed himself as a bit of a superhero in this sense.
Yeah. I mean, he's basically a CIA spy, just not working for the CIA.
Of his own volition.
Yeah. It's like a private spy.
What's odd about this story is that Stetson Kennedy might not be all that he is cracked up to be, or what we've said so far. A year after the Freakonomics book was published, the authors Dubner and Levitt issued a correction to their description of Kennedy, stating, quote, the story of Stetson Kennedy was one long series of anecdotes, which no matter how many times they were cited over the decades, were nearly all generated by the same self-interested source. As it turns out, it's hard to say how much of Stetson Kennedy's story is true, a charge mainly led by historian Ben Green in 1999. Green based this accusation on two main points. The first of which is that a number of the interviews and information obtained by Kennedy had been achieved publicly, not while undercover inside the Klan. And this means that a lot of the information that he got could have been found in Klan mailed pamphlets or through interviews that he conducted with people while he was writing, not, as part of being undercover in the Klan. Green's second point was that Kennedy concealed the existence of an unnamed collaborator known only by the pseudonym John Brown. Green believed that it was this John Brown who had actually acquired the majority of this undercover information, and that Kennedy had taken the credit as Brown wanted to remain anonymous.
Why would you want to take the credit and risk being killed by the Klan?
I mean, I think that's a good point, that there's obviously some danger involved, but I think the idea is that Stetson Kennedy was a writer, a published writer, and there was definitely something to gain by telling these stories, by writing them as he was the one doing them. So I think that was kind of the point that the Freakonomics authors were making by describing him as the same self-interested source, that these stories basically all fell back to him, that he was the only source for them. So he obviously had something to gain by saying that he was the one who was doing them. The point here is that somebody infiltrated the Klan. Well, I mean, Stetson Kennedy did. I think we can agree that. Whether or not he obtained all this information himself, or some of the more risky to obtain information came from an unknown person that is named only as John Brown, that's a little uncertain. But the point that they're making is that Kennedy kind of took credit for all of this information, whether he was the one to originally obtain it or not.
Yeah, it's weird. Why would anybody want to take credit for it?
All about the money, man.
I mean, I guess, but you're crossing an organization which is often violent.
I mean, I think he probably weighed the risks of that and viewed that publishing this stuff as his story was more important, more valuable. And
yeah,
we'll touch later on kind of how that risk affected him too, potentially the Klan wanting retaliation. Back to kind of the controversy here. Ben Green also interviewed Georgia State Prosecutor Dan Duke, who Kennedy had claimed to work alongside during his undercover investigations. Duke stated that Kennedy did infiltrate some Klan meetings, but some of his story had been dramatized. Duke was also interviewed by Peggy Bulger, who at the time was the head of the American Folklife Center of the Library of Congress, and she had previously written her PhD dissertation on Stetson Kennedy. Duke told her that Kennedy, quote, didn't do it all, but he did plenty. Bulger maintains that Kennedy was candid about having combined multiple narratives into one story, and she said his purpose was to expose the Klan to a broad reading audience and to use their folklore against them, which he did. After the Freakonomics authors issued their correction of Kennedy, Bulger accused them of, quote, holding Stetson Kennedy responsible for the inadequacies of their own research. Basically, what she was saying was that he was upfront with her about the fact that his story was kind of a combination of some other sources, but they didn't go to do that research themselves.
Right.
I don't know. I didn't write either of these books or talk to anyone specifically for this episode. So I think it's a little bit of semantics. I think we can agree that Stetson Kennedy did something. He went undercover and collaborated all this research, even if he wasn't the sole person doing it.
Right.
However you land on the matter, I think that there's one opinion that can't be ignored, and that is former Georgia Governor Ellis Arnall, who wrote a letter to Kennedy on July 27, 1946, in which he stated, quote, "You have my permission to quote me as making the following observation. Documentary evidence uncovered by Stetson Kennedy has facilitated Georgia's prosecution of the Ku Klux Klan." So clearly, his work mattered.
Yeah.
In his later years, Stetson Kennedy worked as a journalist for various publications, most notably the New York Post. In 1950, he ran as a write-in candidate for the U.S. Senate on a platform of not white supremacy, but right supremacy, which is so cringy, I can't believe he didn't win that election.
Oh my God. So did he mean right as in moral or right as in conservative when he said right supremacy?
I have to assume he meant right as in morally right.
Yeah.
I don't think... I can't really speak to that, but I don't know if the divide of right versus left was quite as stark then as it is now. But just based on how much we know about Stetson Kennedy, I would guess that he was quite a bit more left-leaning in his personal politics. But I don't know, just the idea of right supremacy, even as a moral right and not a political right, just feels very awkward. I don't want any politician to use the word supremacy.
As you probably shouldn't.
In the early 1950s, Kennedy moved to Europe for two reasons. Number one, he had been aware of a bounty placed on him by members of the KKK. So there you go. Had to escape to Europe because of his, sort of gained fame and having infiltrated the Klan. The second reason was that the books he was working on about his time with the KKK were considered too incendiary to be published in the US, but not in France.
So anti-KKK views were too incendiary in the United States at this time?
I don't know that
or was it more just information about the KKK was
I don't know that it was
too graphic.
Necessarily anti-KKK views, but maybe just talking about some of the actions that they did or even just their beliefs were pretty graphic for our puritanical American audience. Kennedy remained in Europe for 8 years. Here he wrote and published the first version of I Rode with the Ku Klux Klan. He also flew to Geneva, Switzerland to testify against forced labor practices at Florida turpentine camps, which I think is funny that he was still continuing to work on behalf of these labor unions this much later in his life. Kennedy remained socially active throughout his life. He participated in the Woolworth lunch counter sit-ins. He reported on demonstrations with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He continued writing and propagating on Floridian folklore and culture. He also, a little bit of personal background, claims that he was married 5 times, although it may have actually been 7. He's actually quoted as saying, "I'll leave it to the historians to decide how many times I've been married."
Leave it to a folklorist to make things ambiguous. How can you actually trust anything he says fully? Because I feel like he's just predisposed to exaggerate and tell tall tales.
I think that's very telling about Stetson Kennedy. Maybe we're not sure how much of his story is true, but just that there's some truth to it, and the rest is maybe folklore. He had one child, a son named William Stetson Kennedy, who was born in 1942. Kennedy died on August 27, 2011, and per his request, rather than a funeral, a party would be held at his home, which is known as Beluthahatchee Park. Don't know if I said that right, but the name Beluthahatchee describes a mythical Florida Shangri-La, where all unpleasantness is forgiven and forgotten, which is very in line with the Florida folklore for which he was known. This park contains a wildlife refuge and is now designated as a landmarked historic site. Throughout his career, he received numerous awards, including the Florida Folk Heritage Award, the Peace and Unity Award, the Jules Verne Medal of Honor, which is named after the author of Around the World in 80 Days, which we've discussed on our podcast in previous episodes. He also was given the NAACP Freedom Award, among many others. He always gave advice to young people when he would do these speaking engagements and talking about his writings, where he said, pick a cause and stick to it. And I think that's important. That's good advice. That's kind of how he lived his life. Like, he had some strong feelings about racial activism, among other types of activism, and that's something that he really did stick to throughout his life. Whether you believe his story or not, I think we can say that he was probably a good guy who really did make a difference in the world.
Yeah, seems like a pretty good guy. He'd be fun to go to dinner with and, interview.
Yeah, I don't know how much you would believe, but I think he would tell some great stories. Not even just about himself. Just, I'd like to travel through Florida with him and have him just tell me about what people believe and the culture there. He'd make a great tour guide.
For sure. Well, do you feel good about your quiz today?
I don't know. There was quite a bit of his story, not his story, I guess, but his background that I left out of the episode. So I'm curious to see what you dug up.
I got a couple things. But we'll see how you do. I think you might do well.
Let's bring it on.
We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. As many of you know, we like to end each episode with a short quiz for our host to see how thoroughly he studied his topic, and also to give our listeners a chance to test their own knowledge of the history surrounding each week's topic or theme event.
How many times did you say topic in that sentence?
Too many. That's edit them out. I don't know.
Yeah. I do that sometimes where I'm like, did I just say that word 3 times in one sentence?
So today, for today's topic, I have questions relating to today's topic for Phil. Where the hell was I before I was being an asshole? How do you feel about your quiz today, Phil? Do you feel good?
Oh, I never feel good. I think on our last episode I said that I hadn't gotten a quiz question right in several weeks, and I'm going to aim to continue that streak.
Yeah, I love it. I've got 2 questions about Stetson Kennedy and 1 question about the KKK today.
Great. Love me some KKK history. I felt so uncomfortable Googling that. Not that, like, I haven't been reading
You're
about Nazi
definitely on a watch
stuff
list
and, like,
now.
I feel more uncomfortable reading about the KKK than I do about Nazi things. Because, like,
yeah,
not that there aren't Nazis that still exist today. Clearly. Just talked about
there
them
are.
several minutes ago. But, like, the KKK just feels a lot closer to home. Where, like, if that shows up on my search history, I feel like someone might think I'm considering some things that I absolutely am not. And I don't want that to be associated with me.
That's fair. I think that's like a fair assessment. I wouldn't either.
Just going to put that out there in recording and then publish this on the internet so people know that I am pretty good with not being considered part of the KKK in any way.
In any way. Well, now you're on some sort of algorithm. You looked it up.
That's all right. Google knows everything about me.
They'll probably read that you want spoofs of the KKK culture, and that's what you'll get instead of serious messaging. Anyway, to your quiz. Question number 1. Founded by Kennedy himself, the Stetson Kennedy Foundation is a charitable organization dedicated to what? And I'll take any one of 4 different answers.
I
or
was
you can
on
try to name
his
as many of them
website, and I remember reading about the Stetson Kennedy Foundation. My immediate guess is something to do with, like, writing, like journalism almost. But I could also see it being just based around preserving folklore and that kind of cultural aspect.
That answer is correct.
Okay.
So the Stetson Kennedy Foundation is dedicated to human rights, social justice, environmental stewardship, and the preservation and growth of folk culture.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was going to be that
this.
or like a writing scholarship, like a journalist scholarship.
Right.
But folk
that
culture
would make sense.
Makes sense. I mean, all of that makes sense for his story, but I just got the sense that, like, this activism was very important to him, but, like, he always went back to folklore and folk culture. Like, that was, like, his true...
That's what he knew.
Yeah, that's what he was really into.
Question number 2. What legendary singer-songwriter became a fast friend and frequent guest at Kennedy's Florida home at Lake Beluthahatchee? At Lake Beluthahatchee in St. Johns County. And I can give you multiple choice if you want it.
I'm, like, so confident that if I hear you say it, I will know it, so I want the multiple choice. But I say that, and now I'm really worried you're going to give me the multiple choice. I'm not going to get it right. But I need to get one. I need to go for it on this quiz, so give me the multiple choice.
So your options are Louis Armstrong, Elvis Presley, Ella Fitzgerald, or Woody Guthrie.
It's Woody Guthrie.
That is correct.
All right. The other ones
Nice.
were like too. I was like, I would have remembered those names. It's Woody Guthrie.
Yes, it was Woody Guthrie. I hate multiple choice questions because it took me forever to like sort through people that like weren't so obvious, but they were still kind of obvious. And finally, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, how many still operational KKK groups were there as of 2021?
I don't even have a guess. Like, I feel like it's going to sadly be more than I'm thinking, but part of me hopes that it's a very small number. I feel like there's quite a few, but they're probably pretty spread out with small membership.
Mm-hmm.
So give me somewhere in the 20s, like 22.
You're pretty close. It's 25.
Ah, all right. I mean, that's
So,
disappointing,
and honestly,
but like
that was less than I thought. Honestly, that was less than I thought there would be.
What do you
And
mean
I feel
by
like,
those?
I mean,
Like,
those are just like the formal ones that are
What-
obvious enough for them to know about.
would that be like a certain state, like a KKK group that's associated with a state, or what do you mean by those
Some
types
of them,
groups?
some of them are like, hold on one second. Filter by ideology. Ku Klux Klan.
Oh, gosh.
They have they have a hate group map.
Good.
It's great.
Don't you feel like those people should be on a registry, just like the sex offender list?
So they're not in every state, at least not formal ones. But there's quite a few in Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, and Texas. And then it looks like there's 2 recognized ones in Indiana, 1 in Ohio, and there's at least some suggestion of activity in Pennsylvania and Maryland. They don't have any named groups here, but the state is still selected as an active KKK state.
It's interesting that that's exactly, what we said was the second iteration of the KKK was southern states and some pockets of the Midwest.
Yeah.
And it is mostly like small towns, I would assume. Like, I'm sure none of those are short of maybe like, I'm sure you have like the Atlantas and, I don't know, maybe a couple big cities in Alabama and Texas, but like probably a lot of them are based out of areas that aren't heavily populated.
Right. Yeah, well.
Sad part of America's landscape.
It is a sad part of America's landscape. But there are many others. Don't fret.
It's not as bad as it could be, I guess. And that's a terrible way to think about it.
Oh my God. How bad could it be?
I mean, look at the KKK in the 1920s and...
Oh, you mean right now?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Like,
I thought you were saying overall in our history.
No, like the Klan still exists, but it's like exists because it's just those random odd pockets that,
Yeah.
you would like to pretend don't exist until they come crawling out in things like Charlottesville 2017. But they're there, and every country has their problems.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, thank you guys for listening to another episode of History's B-Side. This one was actually fun to put together. I've had it on my list for a long time, and I decided to finally give it a go. It's interesting to read about, these smaller people, particularly in American history, because they're the ones, like I said, that feel a little bit closer to home and maybe make you a little uncomfortable. If you guys have any questions, suggestions, comments, feedback, corrections, any of that stuff, feel free to email us, historiesbside@gmail.com. Follow along on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at History's B-Side. We appreciate you. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week.
History's B-Side is an independent, listener-supported podcast.
Leave us a review or subscribe to the show on your favorite podcasting service. And follow along on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at History's B-Side.
Send us your feedback or inquire about sponsorship and advertising opportunities by emailing us at historiesbside@gmail.com.
You can donate to the show at buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside. While you're there, check out our membership perks, merchandise, and more.
This episode was researched and produced by your hosts, Matt Melito
And Phil Hall. Thanks for listening to History's B-Side.